and welcome to today's edition of The Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Ruth Watson. My guests today are Hugh Marshall, founder of Talking Wales, and Drew Hendry, SNP MP for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey. Hi guys, thanks for joining us today. Well, we've got a full programme. I shall be expecting your views on many perspectives. But first we shall go to the Ukraine update on day 662 of Russia's war in Ukraine. Following months of talks, Turkey, Romania and Bulgaria are planning to sign a deal on a joint plan to clear mines in the Black Sea as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine this coming January, according to Turkish Defence Minister Yasar Güler. A third Ukrainian truck driver has died in blockades at the Polish border staged by Polish truckers, Ukraine's Suspilne public broadcaster said on Saturday. The driver took ill at the Krakowicz-Korkowska crossing, one of 4 points affected by the protests. He died while being taken to hospital. 2 truckers had died last month after becoming snared in the blockades. Moldovan President Maia Sandu hailed the adoption by Parliament of a new defence strategy, calling for anchoring Moldova alongside its Western allies and identifying Russia as a threat to the former Soviet state. Sandu posted on Facebook 2 days after the European Union agreed to open talks on extending its membership with both Moldova and neighbouring Ukraine, more than 21 months into Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Hungary will veto Bulgaria's entry into Europe's passport-free Schengen zone unless it scraps a transit tax on Russian gas, the Hungarian Foreign Ministry said on Saturday. The veto threat follows Thursday's agreement among all 27 European Union members except Hungary to start accession talks with Ukraine, despite its invasion by Russia, bypassing Prime Minister Viktor Orban's grievances by getting him to leave the room. Vladimir Putin will run for president again as an independent candidate with a wide support base but not a party ticket. An initiative group made up of over 700 politicians and figures from the sporting and cultural worlds met on Saturday in Moscow and unanimously endorsed Putin's nomination as an independent candidate, Russian news agencies said. The Ukrainian Air Force said on Saturday that it had repelled a Russian drone attack overnight, shooting down 30 of 31 drones launched by Moscow. The attack targeted regions including the capital Kyiv, the southern region of Kherson, as well as the western Khelmensky region. A Ukrainian missile attack on a Russian-held village in southern Ukraine killed 2 people, Moscow's occupying authorities in the Kherson region said on Saturday. Moscow's forces said the missile hit the village of Novomayachka on the Russian-occupied bank of the Dnipro River and located 7 kilometers east of the Ukrainian-held city of Kherson. Well, that's the news from Ukraine. We move on to Gaza. International support for Israel's war in Gaza could be receding as UK and Germany call for a sustainable ceasefire. The change in mood comes as demonstrators in Tel Aviv, angered by the IDF shooting of 3 hostages carrying a white flag, call for a deal to get the hostages home. Allegations of Israeli war crimes are growing as Al Jazeera refers to the assassination of its journalist Samar Abu Daqqa to the International Criminal Court, taking the total number of journalists killed to 64. I actually thought that it was 92. I saw something yesterday, but it's just the slaughter continues. I mean, Drew, what is the mood down in Westminster? I mean, yesterday there was footage of Israeli bulldozers going into an area, a tented area of people sheltering in a courtyard of a hospital, and there were women, children, babies, people in those tents. I mean, you've got Israeli government ministers referring to Palestinians as subhumans. You've got children in Israel being encouraged to sing songs about wiping Gaza out, and there's a building developer with sort of Zionist, clear Zionist. They've worked on a lot of the sort of illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, and they're now advertising plots for sale by the beach in Gaza. I mean, how much more can a respectable government and politicians take in the UK before people actually stand up and say this is genocide? And what's the mood like in Westminster?
Well, asking about the mood in Westminster, I think there are different moods. The mood from the SNP group that have been calling for an immediate ceasefire for quite a period of time now and brought forward a vote in Parliament, which failed to get the support of Labour or the Tories. Apart from some rebels, I've got to say, some people stood by their principles and actually came through the lobbies with us, and fair play to them for doing that because it's the right thing to do. So the mood amongst our MPs is one of incredible frustration that we can't just get the UK government and the Westminster parties to agree to what should be an immediate ceasefire. Now, welcome the word ceasefire being used by a member of the government for the first time. That's a positive step, and we need to build on that. But I do worry about the caveats that are put in about sustainable and so forth. What we need is an immediate ceasefire. There's too much death and destruction going on just now. Too many innocent children, women, and men being caught up in this action. Some of it, as we've heard from reports, indiscriminate. Some of it even targeting some Israeli citizens, as we heard from that action by the IDF. This is just too much. It's gone too far for too long. They need some respite from this. There needs to be sensible voices about this. And the international community needs to step up, and that starts with the UK, which has failed to do so far. But like I say, I hope now that the word ceasefire has come into it, we can push things on a bit. And certainly the next thing that the UK government must do is instruct their ambassadors to the UN not to abstain from the next ceasefire vote at the United Nations. That has to be carried forward so that we can stop this bloodshed. The problems are deep and wide in the region, but we need to get on and have a ceasefire.
Do you support there are calls for, I mean, the citizenry of the world? We saw 1 million people yesterday marching in Yemen, and the Houthi, so-called Houthi rebels actually seem to be doing, I mean, Yemen seems to be doing a lot to try and sort of disrupt Israel's business as usual. Now the Israelis can't use the, they can't go sort of through the Red Sea. They have to go around Africa for trade. I mean, in terms of the citizenry, should people within the UK, do you think, be doing more? I mean, we've seen demonstrations outside
Yeah.
munitions factories or parts in Glasgow.
Well, I think we've seen a great deal of action from people, and I believe that the UK government, the Labour Party, have been out of step, significantly out of step with people who've let their voices be heard. I think most reasonable people looking at what's unfolding in Gaza can see that it's disproportionate isn't a strong enough word for the action that's been taken against innocent civilians in this conflict. So I think people are doing their bit. Who's not doing their bit? It's the UK government. It's the official opposition in Westminster. They need to get immediately around the word ceasefire and call for that very, very strongly to happen so that we can move forward. But there's no doubt that there should be a stop on arms going to Israel just now from the UK. There should be a stop on machinery and plant that's been used in illegal settlements. That's something that should have been happening for a long time. But I think people are making their voices heard. It's up to the UK government now to listen to that, to listen to the motions we have brought forward in the Parliament, and to make that statement on the international stage that this has just got to come to an end and a ceasefire has to be put into place.
I mean, Hugh, what's the mood like in Wales? I mean, has the Senedd done? I mean, we've seen in Holyrood, our politicians across the board, sort of including Labour, well, not quite across the board, but including Labour anyway, saying that there should be a ceasefire, that the slaughter of innocent Palestinians cannot continue. What's happening in Wales? I mean, has the Senedd made a stand at all?
The Senedd has voted for a ceasefire. I think the Senedd was one of the first to do so, and it shows as well, the difference in political posturing. Because it's interesting, that the opposition and trying to get the ceasefire is being coordinated by the SNP, Plaid Cymru, and the Green Party. So it's something that the majority of people support, and yet it's the smaller parties that are actually sort of leading the charge. And and it shows in Wales, how Labour here operate differently. They voted on on the basis of their conscience. And there was support for that, and even some of the Conservative Senate members abstained instead of they would normally vote against. So yeah, we have there are regular weekly marches in all parts of Wales, but I think just this week, I think it's been a tipping point, especially with what happened yesterday. I was driving all day, and I was listening to the news, and the news was being updated about 3 hostages being shot, that they were dressed as civilians, and they were all the lines were coming out of as Hamas do, and then it's coming out now that they weren't they were topless, so they weren't hiding anything, and they were waving a white flag, and and there's been this commentary all the way through about the IDF, about how they're so careful and everything. The fact that it's clear that they're just anything that moves, they're just shooting it and killing it. So I think they've basically driven themselves into a corner now. That they've lost sort of international support. Even even the states are starting to sort of lose patience. And it was interesting, apparently yesterday they were reporting that obviously Israel had withdrawn their negotiators from negotiations, but apparently those members of Mossad who were responsible for that have been sent back. So obviously they realise that there's been a big mistake. And I think Netanyahu, everybody knows that Netanyahu is finished. They can't get rid of him in the middle of this, but his popularity is going down and down. And the fact that he was when a hostage was rescued, he was the first to sort of make his way to a TV studio to claim sort of what great news it was. But yesterday, when the 3 poor hostages were shot and killed by Israeli forces, he left it to the armed forces to speak about that, and only sort of mentioned it in a tweet. So it's a mess, and unfortunately, the world needs to come together to sort it out. But the fact that that Russia are involved in discussions at United Nations while they're sort of ongoing with an illegal war against Ukraine, the world is just crazy.
It's very worrying, isn't it? We've got Milei, the new Argentinian president, saying that basically demonstrations are going to be banned, and he's sort of actually making very immediate steps to sort of put in place a police state. You've got Putin saying that he's going to go for election, but as an individual, not for any political party. You've got Israel's far right Zionist, taking over. People who were actually removed from standing for office because their views were so extreme, and they're now just basically waging open slaughter, as Russia is in Ukraine. And you've got Donald Trump saying that if he's elected again, he'll only be a dictator for a day. I mean, is it too much to say that as we see the rise of the far right, a story that we're moving on to now, but as we see the rise of the far right, that actually the world is in an extremely dangerous place, democratically speaking? I mean, Hugh, what's your view on that?
I know it is, and I think Wales has shown the only part of the United Kingdom that are actually elected people from the, what we sort of further right than the Conservatives, UKIP, Reform, those parties that have anti-immigration rhetoric at the core. They were elected into the Senate. Fortunately they were voted out. But opinion polling now is showing that reform would get, at the next Senedd election, would get representation and potentially abolish the Welsh Assembly. It's crazy you've got a party that actually wants to get rid of a tier of democracy and in Wales, and having a voice. Getting that support, but we've seen, you saw the news from Llanelli when the hotel was bought with a view of turning it into accommodation for asylum seekers, and it's all part of a game that the Tories are playing. I don't think there was any intention to put anybody there, but again, it just seeds this division within the societies. We have people there, for extreme right-wing people, sort of basically, mobilizing, and they're developing a network, and that's the scary thing is, with the internet, with social media, it's allowed these people who I always used to describe as, the oddball in the pub who sat in the corner that nobody spoke to. Well, the internet has allowed all those oddballs to find each other, and they're coalescing around, anti-vax, all sorts of, conspiracy theories. It's just terrifying how many people out there are going down these rabbit holes.
Well, I mean, it's we've got Rishi Sunak sharing a stage with Italy's far-right Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. He's ramped up his anti-immigrant rhetoric at a speech that he gave yesterday. Despite the dangers of small boat crossings, the UK has closed all safe and legal routes to get here. I mean, most asylum claims are actually, when people do come here make an asylum claim, most claims are approved because there's a legitimate reason, and most of those claims that are denied are approved on appeal. So I mean, but this week an asylum seeker committed suicide on the Bibi Stockholm barge as UK forced routes for Rwanda bill, and I forget the name of the place, the Air Force base down in England where they're keeping these poor souls. I mean, there's people who've tried self-immolation. I mean, it's just absolutely horrific. I mean, Drew, as you watch Rishi Sunak cozying up to the far right in Italy, quite frankly, cozying up to people who, if he was coming to their shores, would be demanding he was expelled from the country. They don't want him or people who look like him, or quite frankly, people with the blood that I have coursing through my veins coming to their country. And you've got, I remember when Giorgia Meloni was running for presidency or for the prime ministerial position, she was talking about how comfortable they felt with the Conservative Party because it was nice to see another far-right party in government. I mean, everybody else across Europe looks at what's happening in Westminster and goes, oh, look, there's a far-right Tory government. Why don't we recognise the far-right in our midst?
Well, it's not through want of trying to point out how far to the right the Tory government have gone in Westminster and how the Labour Party have tracked just very slightly to the left of them. I mean, I don't think there's any difference between the Labour Party now and the Tory Party of 2010, when you make the comparisons on their policies just now. But this move to the right, this, look to blame certain groups of people for the institutional failure of political institutions is nothing new. It's been around for a long time, but it's certainly being geared up. And I think, Donald Trump has been able to mobilize a lot of this fear and, the quick and easy use of a slogan to get people to feel that the reason for their economic woes, for the reason that they're not satisfied with politics is not because of the politicians in the political institutions that have been making decisions on their behalf, but because of other people or other groups. And this is a very commonly used tactic. It is very, very worrying the moment it's got so much traction. But I think that just points to some of the failures. It's not happening everywhere. I mean, there's some really good news in Poland, where they've rejected the far right recently, and there are, I think there is a mobilisation of people to understand that they've really got to make their voice heard to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't continue to happen. But when you come back to Rishi Sunak and the Tories specifically, they're in a position of utter desperation, and that desperation has forced them to court, quite frankly, the kind of people that Conservatives of even 20, 30 years ago wouldn't have dared look at let alone go and cozy up with or cuddle with. And it is a very worrying thing in terms of the political situation in Westminster and how that goes forward. Of course, we would promote the fact that Scotland has an opportunity, an escape route through independence, and we need to move that forward so that we can represent our people differently. But it's a worrying situation for the people of England in particular. And, I've heard from you there that there are some inroads in Wales. I think it's up to all of us to stand up against that kind of rhetoric and, look for, positive and progressive solutions to the problems we have rather than blaming others, which is, like I said, the root cause of this. Just because people have different skin color or different religions or whatever, it makes them no different in what they are, or who they are, or how they intend to work. And as we've seen over the years, the immigrants that have come to work and live in Scotland have actually added more to our economy, more to our communities. There's statistics to back up the fact that they're valuable to us. So this is something we should reject wholesale.
I mean, many years ago, when I was working as a journalist at the BBC in Glasgow, I did a programme about refugees or people sort of waiting for their claim to be approved. After the claim had been approved, it's like they still had a sort of a period that they weren't allowed to work, and it was basically the nub of the program was that there were doctors working as waiters or waiting staff, in medical doctors, working as who could be going ahead and sort of getting their approval, and that actually most of the people who come to this country are the middle classes and the well educated, because they're the only ones whose families can afford to pay for the people traffickers to get them here. So we're actually missing out on a cohort of very educated, skilled people. Sorry, Hugh.
Because the poor person who took his life on the BBC.com, he was a doctor. He could have been helping our NHS, but instead, we chose to punish him and drove him to take his own life.
Well, I think another point about immigration is that when you look at, I represent Highland constituency, and we've since Brexit we've been starved off the people we need for our NHS, for our care sector. We've been starved of the people we need for our hospitality industry, for our tourism industry, and for other businesses as well. There's a whole range of other businesses that have shortages of people to work in them, to the extent where many businesses have cut down to opening 3 days a week, or doing different things in order to make sure that they can operate at least some of the time with it. And we need immigration in Scotland. We've always needed people to come to the Highlands to reverse the traditional population decline that we have here. Scotland benefits very much from people coming and adding to our communities, and it's always historically been a place of people coming and going and creating the unique cultural and economic mix that we have here. There needs to be a real change of tack to look at the benefits that people bring, the way they help to sustain our communities when they come in. Some of the smaller towns and villages, really need people there. Of course, there's other work to do. People always say, but where do you get the houses? Where do you get the services and so forth? And there's other work to do, but that's something that we need to tackle separately and together with this, so that we can make sure that facilities are there for people and people don't feel shut out by that. But essentially, immigration is a good thing, and it's an essential thing for Scotland, and it's an essential thing particularly for us here in the Highlands.
It's one of those things that sort of, especially with the way that the education system is, youngsters go off to universities or to other places within Europe, spend their 20s sort of traveling around, and then tend to come back in their 30s. But so there's that kind of transience, which actually just helps to sort of really enrich communities. But I mean, Drew, you're part of the Westminster bubble, but obviously you get back up north to kind of cleanse the soul a little occasionally.
Burst it out again, yes.
But I mean, what kind of cultural dissonance do you see? I find it really shocking to see. You've got Kemi Badenoch, James Cleverly, Rishi Sunak, and Suella Braverman and Priti Patel, and I mean, these are people who like me, they're either from a mixed background like me, or they are people who are second generation Brits or English people, and or third generation, or in James Cleverly's case, sort of somebody, a relationship that his rules now would not be possible. It wouldn't be possible for his mum and dad to
Mm.
have the relationship that brought him into being because of the rules he's bringing in. Now, to somebody with a mixed race background, I find this absolutely shocking, and I
Mm.
sometimes try and work out, is there some kind of like twisted psychology that they've spent their entire lives being so bullied by the racists around them that they're trying to make out that they're sort of they're harder core and more anti-immigrant than the people who've been bullying them all their lives? Or, I mean, what's going on in Westminster? It just seems absolutely cruel and bonkers.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's for me as a middle-aged white man to try and get into the head of other people in terms of their view on that. But what I would say is that it is quite bizarre. When you look at the opportunities and as I've said already, the talents that people can bring to us, and some of the most fabulous people you work with and or go to see, when you're in the National Health Service or elsewhere, are people who've come from countries far and wide across the globe, come from Europe, have all kinds of backgrounds and ethnic mix within them. And like I say, what we're really looking for is to work and live with people who are contributing to our society. It matters not a jot where they've come from. So I can't give you an answer to your question about what is in the heads of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman and Priti Patel and the rest of them, because I just cannot connect on their level. What I can say is I think it's an absolute issue of self-harm economically, societally, and in just about every other way to be othering people just because they've come from somewhere else, and it is bizarre and dangerous, and as I say, just wrong in terms of just about every measure you would take to look at what we need. We really should be saying, right, what is it we want to do? What positive moves do we want to make, and how do we make that happen? And just wasting money, alienating people, and taking this dangerous shift to the right is not a positive way to be running anything, let alone a series of nations like the UK.
So, I mean, Hugh, we've got the very sad stepping down of Mark Drakeford. I mean, a man who has, you know, was sort of propelled into from my perspective, greatness. Really, I mean, an unsuspecting great politician. Really, I mean, he sort of stepped into the First Minister's premiership, sort of in Wales just before COVID, handled the whole thing with remarkable dignity. I mean, he's just one of these politicians that sort of strikes you as being a really decent guy. I mean, he does what he says he's going to do, and he's kind of like the old Labour. He's kind of like the Labour that I used to vote for many years ago when Labour was on the left. And in the same week that we sort of see Rory Stewart, a man, a conservative, a former Conservative MP with a remarkably right of centre track record on voting, a former Tory leadership candidate, now saying that he would be happy serving as a minister in Keir Starmer's Labour government. I mean, what can we tell from this week about, sort of looking at it from a Welsh perspective, about the future and the fortunes of Labour, and really where it's going?
Yeah, I think pay tribute to Mark Drakeford. He has, he's been pragmatic. The fact that he, at the moment, they're running the government at the moment is, are based on policies that have been agreed in a partnership deal with Plaid Cymru. So he's put people before politics. Remember, he was a Corbyn supporter. And I think he's had a balancing job to do as well, because I think a lot of people, traditional sort of Labour supporters, feel that he could have done more from a left leaning perspective. But he's been very successful in parking his tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawns, and sort of showing that you can be Welsh proud, a proud Welsh patriot and vote for what is basically a unionist party. But what's showing now is in the campaign to succeed him, it looks like there's only going to be two candidates. They were hoping to have a woman on the ballot, but Eluned Morgan isn't standing, and Hannah Blythen, who's the other one, has come out in support of Jeremy Miles. So we have two candidates, Vaughan Gething, who is very much of the Starmer traditional, what Labour are now, sort of perspective. He was the health minister during COVID, and I think the COVID inquiry isn't going to be very kind to him. He's got a series of very unfortunate faux pas on camera, being caught in Zoom meetings, being disparaging of colleagues and other people. So the question marks about his temperament. And but again, Vaughan Gething comes from mixed race background, and there are people already trying to sort of make capital of the fact that if he is elected, you'll have people who aren't sort of white British traditional Christian people in power in Wales, Scotland, and England, and also with Leo Varadkar, who comes from a mixed race background as well, in Ireland, and that's the danger that they're using that as a tool. But then you have Jeremy Miles, then, who is a openly gay man, Welsh speaker, first language, who will probably, again, he's to the right, but I would say he's more sort of middle ground compared to Gething. But he probably would be the biggest threat to people like Plaid Cymru because of Welsh speaking, traditional sort of Welsh speaker. He's the education minister, which is a very difficult brief, but he's a competent person, and his background, his legal background, as well as Gething, the same. But it's going to be interesting. But basically, they are going to shift more towards Starmer. They're going to fight the next general election. They'll probably try and use Drakeford, even though he's gone, as as a campaigning tool. But it'll be interesting to see then if Starmer wins the next general election when it comes to the next Senedd election in 2 years. I think it's 2 years' time. How that campaign will be fought, because previously they fought it as Drakeford, Welsh Labour, but there'll be no clear red water at the next election.
Yeah, it's interesting times politically. And, meanwhile, the UK economy is just sort of plummeting into decline. I was listening to Moneybox Live on BBC Radio 4 yesterday, and it does make for cheerful listening. I mean, this week the Bank of England kept interest rates at the 15-year high of 5.25%, although it has to be said that actually is probably the norm, and what we've seen for the last few years is incredibly low interest rates, which is not the norm traditionally. The latest ONS figures show the UK economy has shrunk by 3%. UK pay growth has dropped while families struggle with the cost of living crisis, and there's yet more to come as fuel companies that have had remarkable profits the prices are going to be hiked again this coming next few months, so that they can try and make back yet more profits because of the losses that they have had from people defaulting because they just can't afford to pay their bills. I mean, there's a measure that the ONS now is, or that there is now being used, which doesn't just look at the which sort of takes into more account the cost of living while looking at the sort of these metrics. And apparently, rather than sort of the 4% that we're being told is gone up, actually the cost of living has gone up by 8%. But it feels worse, doesn't it? I mean, my husband and I, we're lucky, we're doing okay, but we've got more blankets when we're sitting on the couch, and I'm looking at my bills going up, and it actually really scares me, because I know that 200 yards from where I live, there's people that aren't having heating on at all, and it just and they're working 3 jobs. I mean, it's just horrific. I mean, Drew, what's your mailbox like from people? I mean, it must be a difficult time for people, especially up, the further north you get, the colder it gets. I mean, how are people How are we supposed to survive? How are people supposed to live in the current circumstances? 0 hours contracts, wage stagnation, food prices doubling, and farmers not getting a decent cut of it all. I mean, it's just, I don't understand what it is the Conservatives are supposed to be conserving, because it doesn't seem to be anything that I recognise.
Well, I think you raised a good point about, when you said that you feel relatively comfortable and you're worrying about your bills. I think if you translate that to people who felt relatively comfortable a couple of years ago, but now are struggling, and then you go slightly down that chain of income to people who were struggling a couple of years ago, who are now in absolutely desperate straits. And you asked about my mailbox, where I get a lot of people getting in touch. It's the absolute number one concern that people have at the moment is the cost of living. And the UK government have basically ignored the fact that people are struggling. Worse than that, they've allowed a series of shocks to happen. Because you were talking about interest rates perhaps being at, what you might describe as a normal level, having been low for so many years. But of course, what people did, because they were encouraged to do, was take out fixed rate mortgages a while back. Those have come to an end. They now find that their payments are absolutely ballooning. I think across the UK, the figures of 5 million households are set to be hit by an incredible shock in terms of the costs that are going up. But it's absolutely everything, and nothing's being done to help. When you look at the rents that people are having to pay, landlords are putting up rents for tenants, so those are going up. In every house, the food bills have gone up. Food price inflation is still at 11% in the UK, much higher than the rest of Europe, by the way, because of Brexit, self-inflicted problem from the UK Parliament there, supported by the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, of course. You shouldn't forget that. So that's a kind of madness that's going on in terms of people's costs. But the really big one, and the really kind of, I think the most pernicious one just now, is the cost of energy. Because what we see is that prices are higher than last winter. The UK government decided not to, accept our pleas to have the energy bill rebate of £400 reinstated that was there last year. So we've got less support, higher bills. And on, just in a couple of weeks, on the 1st of January, the price cap will change again to put another 5% on energy bills for people. And they're talking about a further rise in the price cap costs for people in the new year to cover the debts from energy companies. Now, that's completely and utterly the wrong way to be looking at a situation where people are absolutely struggling through a cost of living crisis. And I think one of the things, the really untold stories, is going to be what are going to be the effects come February, March on people who've been paying those additional costs, on top of all those other costs they've got just now for the cost of their energy. And despite many, many attempts to get the UK government to acknowledge this and do something about it, they've chosen to do absolutely nothing. So there are big problems. The UK economy, as you pointed out, November contracted by 0.3%. So growth is not going to get them out of this. Austerity, which has been going on for far too long, is not going to help by being turbo boosted, which is what the Chancellor is doing. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about public sector cuts that he's made. But these things are all going to add to the instability of the UK economy over the next number of years. And Labour aren't coming up with any alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you about that, Hugh. I mean, so, you've got Labour sitting in Wales. I mean, sort of, it's, in some ways, it's you guys are an indication of what could be happening, if Labour begins to gain momentum. But do you get the feeling that in Wales people know who to blame? That in Scotland we're being told, oh, Labour represents change, but actually we're looking at what's happening in Wales, and Labour doesn't represent change. Labour represents more of the same. And why aren't Labour standing up in Westminster and voting against, sort of doing more to shout down this. I mean,
Well,
Starmer just seems to go, oh,
just very
yes,
quick,
these are brilliant ideas.
just
Yes.
very quickly before Hugh comes in, I mean, Labour abstained on the finance bill. They described it as awful and then abstained on it. And I
Yeah.
challenged them in the chamber about, if it's so bad, why aren't you voting against it? And they just won't. Sorry, Hugh, I didn't mean to.
No, and you'll find that the Labour MPs who are in Westminster are very different to the Labour members of the Senedd. You've got the likes of Kinnock and Bryant, who it's very difficult to tell if they're Conservatives or not. And I think Bryant used to be a Conservative. But yeah, and I think one of the issues is just, again, it's the lack of people understanding devolution. I think one of the big issues, and it covers all the topics we've covered today, is the media. That people, that's why it's important to have things like Broadcast Scotland, that people can actually have, different voices away from traditional media that is basically just peddling. Not a line specifically, but it's just saying Labour says this, Conservatives say this in response. Conservatives do this, and this is what Labour are saying in response. That's not informing people. It's just it's almost like a pantomime. The problem in Wales is we've all seen the Spider-Man meme on social media of Spider-Man pointing to another Spider-Man. In Wales, it's if anything that's wrong is, well, we're not getting enough money from Westminster. But then, it's a case then, well, why aren't you asking for more powers? Why aren't you, pushing for more devolution? Because I think people need to be aware that the devolution settlement in Scotland is far, far greater, than it is in Wales. And as you know, in Scotland, it doesn't go half as far enough, but there's very little, movement in Wales on, raising additional revenues, and having sort of being able to sort of make moves into things like social security and those elements. Basically, in Wales, we get a grant, a block grant, which basically covers the cost of education and health. And then, they administer that. So the government in Cardiff is basically just administrating on behalf of what the Conservatives allow them to do. Is not enough. So something needs to change, and the problem is that people are turning against devolution because it's not working the way it should be, because it needs more powers, it needs more sort of more muscle, and I think that's the trouble. Is at the moment, I think a lot of people would question, is devolution actually working? As it should do, because obviously we're not in Wales. We're just we've had Labour in government for 23 years, and education is getting worse. The health, the situation in the NHS is getting worse. Everything seems to be getting worse. And when you've got a Conservative government, in Westminster as a layer on top of that, it's quite depressing, because the Conservatives here, the 20 mile an hour sort of change that came in recently, that was handled really badly by Welsh government. The communications around it were poor, and there's been opposition. So you've got the Conservatives just basically pushing out this line of 20 mile an hour blanket coverage. It's not a blanket coverage, but they're saying these things, and also that they want to expand the Senedd, because we need more people to actually have better scrutiny, being able to do more. But again, it's the narrative that social media is driving people, and that's why you're getting these shifts of right and left, I think.
But I mean, looking at on Tuesday, the Scottish Government will announce the tightest budget since devolution. I mean, with devolved administrations having a fixed block grant and limited, and in Scotland, limited revenue raising powers. I mean, we're doing better than Wales, but I mean, Shona Robertson, the deputy first minister, she stood up and she said, well, the UK government is having to spend £318 million daily just on interest rates, interest payments on the debt that the Tories have managed to accumulate. But I mean, Hugh, you're talking there about devolution not going far enough, and people going, oh, well, maybe devolution doesn't work. I mean, surely then the argument is, well, actually, this is the cost of living under Westminster rule, and so we need independence. But how do we make that step? I mean, you've got great changes happening in Wales. So you've got,
Yeah.
Mark Drakeford's leaving, Labour's coming back. It's probably going to be a Starmer, right? I mean, is this going to see the
Yeah.
end of devolution rather than a step towards independence?
Well, it's interesting. So only recently this week, the latest independence polling in Wales is showing the support for independence is growing. And the thing that heartens me, and I think hopefully it'll hearten all three of us, because obviously we're all of a certain age by now. We've got a younger generation who are far more left-leaning, who are far more clued into what's going on in the world. And I think if you look at polling in Wales, for under 25s, there's probably a majority now that supports independence. The trouble is that doesn't necessarily equate to in the ballot box, because it's the same in Scotland. With the SNP, the fact that the independent support in Scotland is steady over 50% and sort of probably increasing as the Westminster shower gets worse. It doesn't necessarily mean then people are going to vote SNP. And same thing in Wales, they're going to vote Plaid Cymru, because what they think is more important is the economy, is health, the education, the cost of living, and it's making sure people understand the differences between these things. But like I say, independence allows us then to have a more progressive, sort of better way of doing things, because the way that Westminster are doing things under the Conservatives, and it doesn't look like under Starmer's, is anything going to change?
Well, I
Can I
mean,
just say,
true. That's. I mean, that the whole thing is polling. The pollsters are repeatedly telling us that people want change, and because the SNP has been in power in Scotland for so long, the SNP doesn't represent change unless the SNP makes the next general election all about the clear route to independence. And that then gives the change that people are looking for, the genuine transformative change that people are looking for. But does the SNP have a clear vision? Does it have the cojones to step up and actually set out clearly, if you vote for the SNP at the Westminster general election, we will take you through this route that will either end with an independence referendum or using Holyrood as a plebiscite? Because I spoke to Jamie Hepburn, the Minister for Independence, shortly after the SNP had brought out, had voted at the conference for this route. And I was saying, as a journalist, the story that I'm seeing coming out, the story that I am seeing, the press release that the SNP put out was only half the story, and sort of stopped at the whole, well, we'll ask for another independence referendum, which has much of the independence movement going, oh, come on, guys, we've been trying that for ages. So when is the SNP going to put out the clear route that the conference voted on, the clear strategy, and make it absolutely clear that to vote for the SNP is a vote for change, because actually this time, guys, we are going to deliver?
well, there's a couple of things. There's a lot to unpack since you started your conversation with you there about devolution, and you've come on to independence. Start answering your question first. Of course, we go into the election, as we go into every election, saying that it's our job to help deliver independence. The route there is complex and it's difficult, and we have to make sure that we get the numbers of people voting for the real change that we need in the future, which is independence, so that we can force that issue over the line. Now, nobody knows what the makeup at this time is going to be of the next Westminster Parliament. That may indeed provide the opportunity for us to take it to the next level. But can I just pick up on something that you were saying about devolution up until now with it? You're absolutely right about the issue with the block grant and the fact that actually that block grant continues to recede, it continues to contract, and it means it makes it much more difficult for us to do the things under devolution that we're doing just now. We don't have the same amount of powers. This supposedly most powerful of devolved parliaments, for example, is even Northern Ireland. And, you can go right around the world and find lots of parliaments and don't have those powers. And the big problem is that block grant situation. And before we lose the thread on the cost of living and the economic side that we're talking about there, it should be noticed that the Chancellor in his autumn statement put in a cut of £19 billion to public services across the UK. And councils are already going bust in England. 6 of them under different controls, Labour, Tory, and Lib Dem, have gone bust. And there's many more that are queuing up to be in the position that they're going to go bust as well. So they're really starving the public sector of funds. Now, the point I want to make here is that when you talk about change and people are looking for change, the change they certainly don't want, I think, during a cost of living crisis, is to have the things that we've been able to do in Scotland through the SNP government taken away from them. So, for example, do people really want to be paying the kind of council tax that they see across England and Wales? Do people really want to see free tuition taken away? Do they want to see things like the Scottish Child Payment removed, free prescriptions, bus travel? Because all of these things under Westminster control wouldn't be there. And indeed, if we allow that kind of falsehood to come ahead, that there are no benefits from the SNP having been in power in Scotland and it's time for a change, then we must be wary of the kind of change that would come forward from that, because people would stand to lose a lot of these things that we've done in terms of progressive policies over the time. But there's no doubt, to come back round again to your original question, there's no doubt that what we need to do is move forward to independence. The polls are showing that in terms of the demographics, the younger age groups up to the middle-aged age groups are all now very much for independence. We've got to use that pressure in order to, public pressure, in order to motivate people in a democratic society to vote for independence, so that we can then apply that pressure to the UK state. The UK state is in a state just now. It's not in a position to be sustainable as it is at the moment. There is widespread discord in terms of UK democracy. And I don't believe that it can stand the pressure of the people of Scotland voting, again, to say that they want the real meaningful change that they need, which is independence. And I'll certainly be taking that message into the next election.
But I mean, in terms of the Scotland standing in the international community, which obviously is really important as we look to being an independent nation. I mean, at the beginning of the week, the Scottish Government published its annual report of its international network, which showed the positive impact that network has made to the Scottish economy. And yet the day before, Lord David Cameron had threatened to block Scotland's access to UK diplomatic services. I mean, what does this say to you about the insecurities within the UK government and the way that it feels that it has to kind of control Scotland and Scotland's messaging, and how do you think this plays out internationally and in Scotland? I mean, it was made very clear that Scotland's not allowed to speak. Scotland's government officials aren't allowed to speak to international politicians without a Foreign Office member being there. And yet the Foreign Office official that was supposed to be there declined to be there. And Scotland said, no, fine, well, we're going to go ahead and do it anyway. So how much do we just need to actually get on and do the job and go for it, rather than sort of, wait to kowtow to Lord Cameron and his ilk?
Well, I think this builds on my previous point about the state of the UK at the moment, and the fact that actually that pressure for independence is far more important now to maintain that electoral pressure than it ever has been, because there's a reason that the UK government are terrified of the Scottish government, going out and engaging. They're terrified of the polls that they see coming through in terms of independent support, because they know that they're not going to be able to stem that tide, and they're looking to do everything they possibly can in order to set that back. But it's a false move to try and stop international engagement, because again, it's another thing, just like Brexit, of self-harm when they do so. You only have to look at some of the engagement that the Scottish government's undertaken, where the UK government has been absolutely absent from this, such as, and again, just across the water from where I'm sitting just now, there's a £300 million investment in renewables manufacturing coming from Japan. And largely because of the engagement that's been made by the Scottish government in order to bring that to Scotland. And when you go around, as I have done in my previous role under Foreign Affairs, when you go around to different countries, speak to people across Europe, across the other continents, and you speak to people about their views of Scotland, they're incredibly positive about Scotland. But the word that always comes back is they're amazed that we have this, that, and the next thing. Some of the American congressmen I spoke to weren't even aware of the hydrogen opportunities or the renewable opportunities that we had here, because the UK government, quite frankly, hasn't been prioritising Scottish needs and never has been. And it never will, because it's not in their interest. So when it comes to scale, we're a very, very small part of their portfolio. So why should they? If it weren't for the fact that, some of their biggest exports in the balance of trade, are things like whiskey and other food and drink products from Scotland, they probably wouldn't be interested at all. But they can take an enormous amount of tax from that. But these things are just not being carried forward by the UK government properly, and that's why the Scottish government's had to do it. So it's a very, retro. I'm struggling to find the word, but it's a bad thing to do for them as well, because it harms UK GDP if they're not doing it. But we have to step in and do it.
I mean, Hugh, when I was a youngster, I used to live just up from the Murrayfield Rugby Stadium, and I used to love going down at the middle of the street, sort of when Wales and Ireland were playing, and honestly, the Welsh rugger fans are absolutely brilliant, and they would always be sort of like talking about this kind of like the Celtic cousins, and. I mean, can you see the importance going forward of perhaps like people sometimes talk about, a Celtic alliance? If sort of perhaps, is this something which sits within the Welsh psyche politically about, you watch, do your guys watch what's happening with Scotland and our international, our sort of ambassadorial efforts and the sort of the mini consulates that we're sort of establishing, and go, oh, we could have a bit of that, or maybe we could sort of, get a wee bit of our game on working with the Scots on this?
I think definitely, and I think we've benefited in Wales from having such a strong representation by the SNP at Westminster, because obviously we get to hear at PMQs, the profile has risen, and the fact that sort of Plaid Cymru and SNP work together, not just in Westminster but in general. But I think there is this Celtic connection, because obviously the thinking, it's the old-fashioned thinking of we were all sort of Welsh and Scottish at one point, until the Anglo-Saxons arrived and pushed you up there and us to the side. And obviously, the connections with Ireland, with both countries, are huge. But again, we have to remember that we're part of, at the moment, part of the United Kingdom, which has one constituent that is 84% of the population. It's just so dominating, and the media, the media that we consume here in Wales, generally it all sort of originates from London. It looks at everything from an English perspective, which is understandable, but it doesn't allow people to understand, sort of what's going on in Wales and Scotland as much as they should be.
Well, that leads me on perfectly to be trying to say to people why it is that people should be broadcasting Scotland supporters, obviously, because we need to be having our own independent media, even if it is operating out of people's spare bedrooms sometimes. Well, I mean, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. We have raised a fantastic £22,000. I mean, we're in a cost of living crisis and people have donated that money, so thank you very much, guys. But in order to be able to continue making programmes in the coming year with even more cost of living crisis hitting us, we need to raise the remaining £8,000 immediately. So if you've got a spare bob down the back of your sofa, or Oh, right. Okay. Well, the voice in my ears is saying that actually it's going to be 38,000 imminently because we've got next year's funding to try and get. So Drew, if you've got any rich pals, go and ask them to tweet it out. Anyway, so
Unfortunately, I'm
thank you
not a
very
Tory.
much. Ah, darn. Well, thank you again to our guests, Hugh Marshall and Drew Hendry. I'm Ruth Watson. Goodbye, and
Yeah,
thank you for
thank
watching.
you.
Thank you.